may well determine which way your life shall go. And the question is whether you have a proper, a solid, and a sound blueprint. And I want to suggest some of the things that should be in your life's blueprint. Number one, in your life's blueprint should be a deep belief in your own dignity, your own worth, and your own somebodyness. Don't allow anybody to make you feel that you are nobody. Always feel that you count. Always feel that you have worth. And always feel that your life has ultimate significance. Secondly, in your life's blueprint, you must have, as a basic principle, the determination to achieve excellence in your various fields of endeavor. You're going to be deciding as the days and the years unfold what you will do in life, what your life's work will be. Once you discover what it will be, set out to do it and to do it well. Be a bush if you can't be a tree. If you can't be a highway, just be a trail. If you can't be the sun, be a star. For it isn't by size that you win or you fail. Be the best of whatever you are. And finally, in your life's blueprint must be a commitment to the eternal principles of beauty, love, and justice. Well, life for none of us has been a crystal staff, but we must keep moving. We must keep going. If you can't fly, run. If you can't run, walk. If you can't walk, crawl, but by all means, keep moving.
Wait for them to get the slide set up. Good morning, Men of Hope. How's everybody doing this morning? Awesome, awesome. Maybe the slides will come up. You guys queuing those up? Okay, anyway, I'll introduce myself. So my name's Dennis Murphy. I've been in Hope, well, I guess with Hope, for the last 10 years. Moved here from Minnesota after a 21-year military career. Retiring a couple years ago. So today I'm going to talk to you about a couple things. If you could go back a slide. We're not to that yet. Yeah, just stay there. So I talked to Andy actually a couple years ago. I was actually supposed to give this talk 2 years ago, right before COVID. Can you guys hear me? Am I too close to the microphone? Okay. I was supposed to give this talk 2 years ago, and as it turned out, my life story was still going. I had just, and I'll kind of talk about this here in a little bit, but I had just gotten through some very tough time, family issues that I'd gotten through, and thought I was kind of on the other end of it, and really wasn't. And, there was still a lot of things that God wanted to do. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about that today, talk a little bit about some of the struggles that I've had, how I've come kind of full circle with some of that. But a lot of it was understanding my story. I'd never really taken the time to sit down and do what you guys are about to do or doing right now, which is really kind of looking at it, not only spiritually, but looking at it kind of analytically. And I'm kind of an analytical guy, so I like having things kind of written down. So I had that opportunity to do that a couple years ago, and I'm going to actually kind of walk you through some of the learnings that I had that I hope will help you as you go through your life story and why that's important. Next slide. So you kind of look at this, you're like, what does this have to do with a life story? Well, as I said, I spent 21 years in the military as a military officer and retired a couple years ago. And, as you look at these two pictures, to me it kind of talks to me. I'm kind of big in analogies and just kind of looking at things through different lenses. And so I wanted to kind of give you a picture of my lens and kind of how I look through things. So in the military, you have what they call offensive operations or defensive operations. So offensive operations, you're on the move. These guys right here on the left are doing some kind of clearing operation. They're probably going room to room, making sure there's no bad guys inside. The other one, he's in some kind of defensive posture. And I've kind of used that same analogy in my life, I love Martin Luther. He's one of my all-time favorites because this guy was had a very good sense of who he was, had a very strong faith, as most of you know, but he was all about moving forward, despite the obstacles. And I think we all probably agree. I mean, he had probably arguably more obstacles than most of us had, especially in the time frame that he lived, and being very outspoken. But same exists in the military. There are all sorts of obstacles, and the military, they're always taught to move forward. You're always taught to be in an offensive posture, to be leaning forward. Being the aggressor, I guess, is kind of comes to my mind. And I've kind of taken that same analogy in kind of the way I've looked at my story over the last 4 years. And I think sometimes we can feel like like our life's just happening and we're just trying to keep up. There's nothing we can do to change our narrative. I know probably quite a few men in this room were not necessarily born into Christian families that have nuclear families that were perfect and everything was going well. We all have different circumstances, right? And I think sometimes we're born into a circumstance, or we're we have circumstances happen to us. We feel like we're a slave to those circumstances. We feel like there's nothing we can do to change the narrative. And I think, especially guys, we tend to, we tend to have a hard time going deep. I was actually having a conversation with a couple guys this morning over at one of these side tables, and one of them had quoted a statistics of, most guys have 0.7 deep friends, and I said, well, that's probably 0.7 higher than I would have guessed. And, we kind of chuckled about it, but it's really true. I think, it's hard to go deep on some of this stuff because it's painful, it's embarrassing, we have to feel stuff we don't want to feel, and so I think being purposeful about that is very important, so you can kind of see some of your life's hurts and maybe where you've been and piece those together, kind of figure out where you're going so you don't feel stuck. So go to the next slide real quick. Thank you. You may not be able to see this whole thing, and that's fine. So you're kind of looking at this paper, you're like, man, there's a lot of stuff on here. Well, there is. So a couple years ago, one of the many really tough things that have happened in the last 8 years happened to me. I lost my wife to cancer after 3 years. I was getting ready to retire from the military. She passed away of cancer. And literally overnight, I moved from Minnesota here. I retired. I became a single parent, a widow. Found out I had post-traumatic stress disorder, found out I had traumatic brain injury from my time in the service. And I remember sitting here thinking, like, how in the heck am I going to keep going? So I actually reached out to somebody in the church here who was doing life plans, and never heard of a life plan. I'm like, I don't know what the heck a life plan is. Like, what's the value? And so we kind of talked about it, and it's kind of what you guys are doing here, maybe on a little bit more academic level, but we basically spent like an entire day pouring through my life. And so if you can imagine I guess this is like two different little charts together, but I think at the end of the iteration, we had like 65 of these charts all the way around the room. So he kind of starts with who you are, what's important to you, and then he moves into like, what are your goals, and and then we get to like, this is kind of like 3/4 of the way through, and what he did here is he charts all the important parts of my life, good and bad. So that's kind of what you see with that line. You see, I get married, and, we have kids, and I'm in Europe, and, we're having a great time. And then, kind of like your midlife, your 30s, like, hey, something good happened, something bad happened. My grandpa died. Another kid was born, got out of the military initially, got back in, had a bike accident, almost died in a ragbri accident about 10 years ago. And then you see like a flat line across. And if you took that another 2 years, it'd be almost a flat line for almost 4 years. And I'll kind of get into that here in a second. But he also charts, family, kind of what family stuff was going on, what vocation stuff was going on. So if you see vocation, that's almost all filled out, because I always kind of identified myself with what I did, not necessarily who I was. And although church and God have always been important to me, you see, kind of spiritually, I was just kind of absent. Like, I was just kind of along for the ride. We were moving every couple years, and it was It was kind of it was just a thing, you know. It was just a thing. Went to school went to church on Sundays. That was about it. What really stuck out to me as he did this was how drastic some of these shifts had been in my life. You know, how I, had something bad, but I recovered, had something bad, I recovered. And then, like the last 4 years, again, as I told you, it was dealing with my wife's death, dealing with being a single parent, dealing with the realities of having post-traumatic stress disorder, which is not an easy thing for anybody to realize, and then traumatic brain injury, relationship issues, anger, as you probably would understand. You lose somebody and you go through all range of emotions, anger, sadness. You want to blame people, you want to blame yourself, all that stuff. And, as I went through this with this individual, I couldn't, it was crazy to be able to see it up on a chart and just realize that I had been through so much pain, yet I was still here. I was still here for a reason. Like, there were any number of times here where I probably could have not been here, especially some of the service-related things that I was involved in. But, I started looking at this, and I was like, there are things that I need to change this dynamic at the end here. Because what I don't want to do is go another 40 years flatline, especially flatline in my spiritual life. And that's kind of what he had asked me at the end. He's like, well, what do you want to do? Like, so vocation was a big thing to you, and now it's really not. Now you're telling me that community and religion, that's kind of what you want your focus to be. I said, yeah. I said, well, you're going to have to make some changes. You're going to have to understand some of those hurts. You're going to have to dive into some of those hurts, and you're going to have to get, like, real with some of that stuff. And no guy wants to be told that you've got to get real with some of that stuff, because it's messy, right? It's emotional. It's like you got to talk about your feelings. Like, you guys like talking about your feelings? Huh? Who likes? Nice. There we go. I love it. All right. So one guy out of 100 like to talk about their feelings. Okay. I'll see you afterwards. We'll talk about our feelings together. So anyway, yeah. So that was really hard for me, because that's military guy. Like, I'm not talking about my feelings. That's what women do. And I've really had to, through some of the hurts that I've had, I've really tried to dive more into that and to get to know why certain things trigger certain things. Because I have found, as I've kind of pieced the story together, a much better understanding of who I am, why I'm that way, and specifically why maybe I was devoid spiritually. And I had no doubt that, had I maybe had a deeper relationship with Christ, a lot of this stuff would have been a lot easier. And I think some of these bumps in the road that you see on my chart would have been smoothed out a little bit. I don't think you would have seen the drastic, like that. So I'm going to talk some of the learnings about this here in a second, but wanted to throw that up there. If you guys could, I guess I could switch got the little clicker here. All right, so as I was going through this journey, and this actually was just kind of a revelation I had about 3 months ago. I remember thinking, like, okay, I'm working through my PTSD, I'm working through my TBI, traumatic brain injury, I'm working through my wife's death, the reality of being a widow, all the stuff, not being a military guy anymore, having a new vocation. I said, like, something's still missing. Like, I don't feel like I have the accountability or the help that I need. And so I remember a chart that had also been part of this process, and this was very revealing back to a point I made earlier. We get to the end of this little process, and he says, okay, so now you have your plan, you have your objectives, you have your goals. What are you going to do to ensure that you're held accountable for this stuff? And I was like, I don't want accountability. I mean, what accountability? Like, I'll just do it. Like, I said I'm going to do it. It's like, no, you have my word, I'm going to do it. He's like, no, that's not good enough. He said, we're going to put a chart together, and we're going to talk about who in your life is going to make you do it. And I'm like, okay, all right, that sounds easy enough. So put it up here, and he basically was forcing me to pick people who were going to pick up the phone, and I was going to talk, like, real about stuff. And I remember spending almost like 45 minutes to an hour on this chart, and that was to pick like 8 names. And at that point, it was like a realization to me, like, man, like, I don't have a lot of deep relationships. Like every 3 years I've moved, I really haven't spent a lot of time with guys, like, talking to them about different stuff. There isn't a lot of people that I would really trust with my stuff. And I remember about 3 months ago, I was thinking about that, and I was like, I had tried like different men's groups and, never had one that really worked out. And as it turned out, God's always kind of looking, is kind of looking, kind of searching. And I remember a gentleman who had also lost his wife not too long ago, and I was reaching out to him. We were talking, and he had mentioned a men's group that he had started or had going for a while, and started going. And what I have found was that was the missing piece of my story, of what I really needed. And I don't believe I would have ever gotten there had I not been purposeful about laying it out and really understanding what I needed to make sure that I got back to where I wanted to be. And it was also just a wake-up call for me as far as relationships and how important they are. Doing things like this, I know it's hard. A lot of you guys don't like getting up at 6 o'clock. Trust me, I got up at 6 o'clock for probably 5 o'clock for 21 years. I don't like getting up at 5 o'clock anymore, but I love getting up at 6 o'clock to do things like this and talk about, why relationships are important, why, it is important to go deep on some of the stuff, talk about your emotions, talk about your hurts, and really realize that your story is still going, and you still have the ability to impact that. And as Martin Luther King said, he wants you to, it's important you move forward. It's important you lean into, the things that are hurtful, the things that have, caused you struggles, because they're going to continue to do that unless, if you depend on yourself. And really, for me, it was depending on other guys, depending on God, trusting them with my stuff, finding other guys in my men's group who are models that have gotten through similar things, and really trusting that they, being vulnerable with them and really trusting that, trusting their opinion, trusting their life experiences, trusting the faith experiences they've had. So these are some learnings that I've had, through my story, and I know we're down to about 5 minutes, so I'll go quick. Got a little note card because I want to make sure I remember everything. Leaning forward, how do you do it? I think that might be a good thing for your group to talk about. I think it looks different for everybody. For me, it was things like getting help for my PTSD. It was talking, relationships that have been broken through pain, through, my wife passing away, rekindling some of those relationships. For me, it was having to start new relationships, and that's not super comfortable for most guys. We're kind of like men and, creatures of habits. Like, hey, if I call you once a year, like, we'll call that good enough. So for me, it was like really having to fight that urge of just kind of crawling inwards and leaning into the different pieces that were not super comfortable. I wasn't super comfortable with, and having kind of an action plan for each of those things. We talk a lot about vulnerability. I don't think I need to go into this. I know the speaker last week talked a lot about it. There's a Bible verse from 2 Corinthians 12, 9 through 10 that talks about, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in his weakness. And, I thought a lot about that over the last few years. There's a lot of different, I think, opportunities that present themselves sometimes that we just kind of ignore because it's not comfortable. And I think, with a vulnerability for me, it was a lot of it's just kind of trusting that God's got you, and trusting that he's putting people in your life that are safe, that can help you work through that stuff. Because most of us, we can't work through this stuff on our own. Like, if you think you can, it probably won't work out for you if you depend on yourself. And for me, that's been kind of a humbling experience, because it's not something I'm used to. It's not something that comes naturally, I think, for most guys, is being vulnerable. I think we all understand, the importance of relationships. God talks about relationships drawing you closer to Christ. And I talked earlier about, having models in our life to help us carry our crosses. I think for me, after all this stuff happened with my wife and post-traumatic stress disorder, I really thought, I've done much more difficult things in the military. Like, I'll just carry my own cross. It'll be fine. And that lasted about a year and a half. And then I crashed. It was about 6 months where I just wasn't functioning, and realized that I cannot do this. God did not wire us to do things on our own. He didn't wire us to be in a vacuum, to live in a vacuum. And I think you find, most of you probably, have been coming to men's group for a while, realize that things just seem so much easier and lighter when you are able to share those with other people who also are followers of Christ and have, models for you in your life. One of the things that I've told myself often over the years, especially the last year, is that circumstances will not steal my joy. And one of the reasons I mention this is because I think sometimes we can get so caught up in our story that we think that everything that happens to us is for a reason, and that causes that triggers our emotion. Like, hey, if something good happens, I'm going to be happy. Something good happens, or something bad happens, I'm going to be sad. And I have found in my life that it causes such drastic emotional changes in me that, I wasn't real satisfied with that. I wasn't really happy about that. And so I leaned into that very, very hard and, came to the realization that, my vocation doesn't define me. My, how I feel about something or somebody doesn't define me. It's my relationship with Christ that really brings me joy. And if I look through that lens at most things, regardless of what happens with my circumstances, I'm going to be filled with joy. And it's not going to be one of these things that's like herky-jerky, because that's really what happiness is. Happiness is not something that's permanent. It's not something you can depend on. So I think it's really, as you look at your life story, look at those circumstances that are causing you pain. How do you even that out a little bit so that, you have something that's lasting, joy that's lasting that you can count on, that can bring you even through the toughest times. I have a card that I keep on my desk, a little 3x5 card. It says, "You are not broken. You are not a victim. You are not unredeemable." And I could tell you that there's a lot of times that I feel broken because some of this pain is so deep in me that it never goes away. I mean, PTSD is not something that you just wish away. And sometimes I do feel very broken, like, hey, did I have some of this stuff coming? What did I miss? All those kind of triggers in your brain. And, I have to remind myself, and I think the speaker that said this last week said it as good as you can. He said something to the extent of, you need to ask an as kicking, and God wants you to come as you are. You're not unredeemable. I think we have this tendency to hey, I'm going to come to men's group once I'm fixed, or hey, I'm going to fix this once I feel better about myself, or that day will never come. You're never going to be if you have that mindset, you'll never get there. So you are good enough. You have to change your mentality. Hey, regardless of how broken you feel, you are good enough. You are redeemable. God will meet you where you're at. He doesn't have this expectation of you jumping over a bunch of hurdles. I think our standards are a lot higher than what we think, His standards are for that. So, we do need an as kicking, I think, at some point, and just realizing that, He wants you to come as you are, and He'll meet you where you're at. Love and hope. For me, I think hope is something that is really kind of gotten me to the other side of my story. Again, if I pulled my life story up again, you'd probably see another flat line, and then you'd see it slowly rise. And that's kind of where I've been over the last year, as I've realized that, my story's not done. I've been through a lot of tough stuff, but it doesn't mean that, again, it doesn't mean I'm unredeemable. It doesn't mean God's done with me. In fact, exactly the opposite. I think through some of my tough stuff and having dived into that story and leaned into some of this stuff, I found hope where I never had seen it before. And a lot of it was the people He put in my life. A lot of it was really spending a lot of time in prayer. I think some of us in this room are relatively busy. And so I think it's really hard for guys just to spend time in prayer and reflect. And I think this exercise that you're doing will be very good in that respect. Spend a lot of time in prayer and reflect on those things that have shaped you as you work through your life story. I have no doubt that it's going to have an impact on you if you do it the right way. And maybe you won't come up with something fancy like what I had, but I think you could even put something similar together, kind of piece that together and see what that trajectory looks like. Where have you been? Where are you going in the next 5 or 10 years? And how, what do you need to do to get there? So I am at time, so I'm going to pray for you real quick, and we'll close out. You want to just bow your heads real quick. Dear God, thanks for the opportunity to talk to these men this morning. A lot of us are going through a lot of tough stuff, but we know that you are still there for us. We know that you haven't left us. We know that we're not unredeemable, and we know that we still have plans for us. Help these men, dive into their story, lean into their story, really reflect on what you've done and what you want to do over the next, 10, 20, 30 years of their lives. We ask that you fill them with a sense of hope and love. Give them the courage it takes to dive deep, to talk to other people about the things that they struggle with, and to come out on the other side a better version of who they are and who they want to be as Christians. We ask this in your name. Amen. Thank you for your time this morning.